Hello kids. I thought it would be fun to be working on memorizing the books of the Bible. Now some of you older kids already have them memorized. Some of you younger ones don't. That's okay. It's fun, it's easy, and it doesn't take very long at all. So why is it important to memorize the books of the Bible? Well, it makes a whole lot of difference in a sword drill. But also, when you're reading the Word of God, it's very helpful to get the understanding to know who wrote it, who they were writing to, and what were the circumstances around why they wrote that story or those words. You get a lot of that context and that understanding when you know what order the books come in. So it's really important that we know that and we learn that. So, how many major divisions are there in the Bible? It's important that we understand how they're broken up. So there are two major divisions in the Bible. How do you remember that? Well, how many hands do you have? You have two hands, a right hand and a left hand. And likewise, there are two major divisions in the Bible. There is the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament has 39 books. The New Testament has 27 books. So the Old Testament is quite a bit larger than the New Testament. How do you remember how many books in each? Well, that's easy. If you look at the word old, how many letters are there? There are 3 letters. And how many letters in the word testament? 9. So 3 and a 9 make 39. That's how many books in the Old Testament. If you look at the New Testament, 3 for new and 9 for testament. 3 times 9 makes 27. So 39 plus 27 makes 66 books in the entire Bible. So how many books in the Old Testament? 39. How many books in the New Testament? 27. How many books in the whole Bible? 66. So we're going to learn the books of the Old Testament in this session, and we'll talk about the New Testament in another session. By the way, what does the word testament mean? It means covenant. So the Old Testament dealt with the Old Covenant, the law, and the New Testament deals with the New Covenant, or when Jesus was born, he brought in a new covenant. We have the stories of the Old Testament and the stories of the New Testament. Jesus, when he came, he said, I don't come to destroy the law or the Old Testament. I come to fulfill it. And you know, so many of the great stories of the Bible, the story about Adam and Noah and Joseph and David and Elijah and Elisha, those are all Old Testament stories. So we need both, don't we? We need the Old Testament and the New. They balance each other out. And so we're going to be learning the books of the Old Testament. Now, we know how many major testaments there are because we have 2 hands. But how many divisions in each testament? We have 5 fingers on each hand, so there are 5 divisions in each testament. So let's look at those. So for each finger, there's a division in that testament or that division. So there are 5 divisions in the Old Testament. The first one is the division of the law. Those are the books of Moses. There are 5. The books that Moses wrote. Sometimes it's called the Pentateuch. Sometimes it's called the Torah. But the books of the law is the first division, 5 books. Then comes the books of history. There are 12 books in that group. And that is the history after the law. 12 books in the books of history. Then comes the books of poetry. Some people call them the books of wisdom. And in there, they're written by various authors with wisdom and even some songs. The book of Psalms was written as a songbook. We'll be talking about that. There are 5 books in that division. Then you have the books of the prophets. And some, like for example, the Hebrew Bible, they bundle the prophets together, but we divide them into 2 groups, the major prophets and the minor prophets. It's not that these prophets are big people and these are small people or more important or less important. It's just that these prophets or these preachers wrote big books and these preachers wrote smaller books. One of the minor prophets is just 1 chapter long. So the major prophets, there are 5 of those, and the minor prophets, there are 12 of those. And the divisions are divided in a way that makes it easy to remember. So 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. So we're going to go through the books of the Old Testament. The first division is the books of the law. These are the books of Moses. Moses wrote each one of these. The books of Genesis, the first book is Genesis. This word actually means beginning. And you'll find the stories of Adam and all of the beginnings stories all the way through Joseph in Egypt. Those are all in the book of Genesis. Then we have Exodus. Exodus. Exit, like if you're going out of a room, it was the story of the going out of the children of Israel out of Egypt. So we remember, where do we find the story of the children of Israel going out of Egypt? In Exodus. Genesis, Exodus. Then comes the book of Leviticus. This is the book where the law is written. L for law, Leviticus. Leviticus. Then comes the book of Numbers. And part of this is when they numbered the people. So when they numbered the people is where we find the book of Numbers. And then comes Deuteronomy. The word deuter means second. And this book contains the second, or a repeat of the law that we found in Leviticus. So second law, Deuteronomy. Now some people say Deuteronomy, but I say no. Think of someone that you know by the name of Ron. We know Ron Shanky, Brother Ron Shanky, so we remember him, Deuteronomy. So the first 5 books of the Bible in the law are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay, those are the books of the law. Then we have the books of history, the 12 books of history. And those are divided into 3 groups. The first is the JJR group. Joshua comes right after Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books. When he died, Joshua came next. So we know that Joshua comes right after the books of Moses. Joshua, then Judges, and then Ruth. Ruth is a small book, tucked in between Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel. So the JJR group is Joshua, Judges, Ruth. What's the JJR group? Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Then the books of the history are the 1st and 2nds. We have a group of 3 groups of 1st and 2nds. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Which one comes first? Samuel comes first because he was a judge, but he preceded the kings. So after Judges is Samuel. He came right after the judges. He was one of the judges himself, but he appointed the next king. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, then comes 1st and 2nd Kings, and then usually Chronicles are a story written about a king. They would have to be written after the king. So Chronicles comes last. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The 1st and 2nds. Then comes the ENE group. ENE. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. 2 books in this history division were written about a woman, Ruth and Esther. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the ENE group. So all of the books of history, the JJR, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, then the 1st and 2nds, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and the ENE, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Then comes the books of poetry, the books of wisdom, and they kind of make a pyramid shape if you see them stacked like this. The first one is Job. It's a book, probably the oldest book in the Bible. This one, this is the story of Job, and they think that he preceded most of the stories in the other books. So it may have been the oldest written book. Then comes the book of Psalms. This was a song book, mostly written by David, but others as well. And they were meant to be memorized. They were meant to be sung. The book of Psalms. There's 150 chapters or 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms. Then comes the book of Proverbs. wise sayings, many of which were written by Solomon. And there are 31 chapters in Proverbs, one for each day of the month. Then comes Ecclesiastes, a long book was written by Solomon. And then comes the Song of Solomon. So you see the names themselves make kind of a pyramid. Pyramid shape, and poetry starts with a P, so that helps you to remember. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Then comes the prophets. We have the major prophets and the minor prophets. The first division of the prophets is the major prophets. And again, doesn't mean that they were big men, but they wrote bigger books. So you have 5 major prophets. And for these, to remember them, we just learned this little nonsense word, Ijled. It doesn't mean anything, but it's the first letters of each of the books in that group. So Ijled, if I say Ijled, that will tell you that I'm talking about the major prophets. And what does Ijled mean? Well, the first one is Isaiah, who wrote a book 66 chapters long. What does that make you think of? It's the same number of books in the Bible. And in fact, Isaiah was written in such a way that it breaks after book 30 or chapter 39. So it's like a small Bible in one book. It follows the same pattern as the Bible. So there's Isaiah. Then comes Jeremiah. Jeremiah was described as the weeping prophet. He saw the destruction of Jerusalem and he wept. And because he was the weeping prophet, he wrote another small book that is tucked in with the major prophets, Lamentations. This one doesn't have a name of its writer because Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, and it comes right after his name. So you have Jeremiah and then his Lamentations. Then comes the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is the prophet that saw the dry bones come to life. Ezekiel. And then comes Daniel. Daniel, as we know, is the prophet that was thrown into the lion's den and was miraculously saved when they didn't eat him. So we have the 5 major prophet books: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And if I say Ijled, then you know it's the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. And then you have the last division, the minor prophets. And there are 12 books in the minor prophets as well. So the minor prophets, there are 12 books. Now, what's the easiest way to learn these? There are 12 names. And sometimes we get those mixed up. But it's easy if you remember them in 3s. So most children that are born in our society have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. For example, Brandy Rose Dillabo. You have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. And a lot of times when parents name a child, they think about how does the name sound, and they say all 3 names. When the baby is before they're born or right after they're born, a lot of times they use all 3 names. Our daughter Bethany, Dawn, Hildebrand. We kept saying that to see how it sounds. Well, if you memorize the 12 minor prophets and you memorize them in 3s like we do like we remember names, it makes it a little easier. So if you divide them into 3s, Hosea, Joel, Amos, as if that was one name. Hosea, Joel, Amos. Hosea, Joel, Amos. Hosea, Joel, Amos. You've already got the first 3 of the 12 minor prophets. So the first group of 3 is Hosea, Joel, Amos. The next 3 is Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. And if you say them over and over and over, it automatically comes. When you say them together like that, if somebody were to ask you, well, what comes after Obadiah? Jonah. Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. What comes before Micah? Jonah, because you remember them in 3s. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Then the third group, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Zephaniah. It's a big, long name, and those are a little longer. Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. And then the last three is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. What we have learned right now is all 39 books of the Old Testament, and we're done already. So let's say the minor prophets one more time. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And that's the books of the Old Testament. Next time we'll be learning the books of the New Testament. Not that hard at all. God bless you.